Welcome to Healing Outside the Box. I'm Jean Tiberio, and I'm a nutritionist and a wellness coach. This is episode 292, and I'm calling it, What are Sell-By Dates and Why Should We Care? Now, I thought this was going to be a one-week episode, but then I just went on and on about what I wanted to cover, so this is actually looking like a two-episode topic. Plus, I want to get a few things in before we begin. The first is that my memoir, called Helpers Anonymous, just came out in the audiobook format. It is on Amazon as of yesterday, and it's an Audible selection as well. It's on sale at Audible for $7.47 right now, but I still have some free codes available to hand out. So if you want to message me and send me your first name and email address, I'll send you a free copy of the audiobook. Till supplies last, as they say. So if you happen to be going to my website, just go to my contact page and message me with your first name and email address, and I'll reply with the free audiobook. And if you want to write a review, I won't stop you. Reviews are very precious. Very precious. So again, you can get a free audiobook by contacting me on my contact page, or you can DM me on my Instagram page. To get to my DM page, just type in literally my name, and I'll send you a one-time code for the free audiobook. Now, what are you getting? I'm so glad you asked. As you may know, I am a disabled woman who has round-the-clock personal care attendants to help me with whatever I need to do. Now I work with an agency, but prior to this, I had to privately hire my own people and ask them to be my arms and legs. So it's about my life and the challenges I face as my disease progressed. But it's also about relationships with a group of people who are total strangers when they walk through my door, and they immediately establish a rather intimate relationship with me. But it's also about what went wrong with the personal care attendant system in Massachusetts. The patients were told to take complete responsibility for hiring, firing, training, paying, and managing all of these personal care attendants. And this was at a time when the opioid crisis was peaking, and hospitals and nursing homes were shutting down their leaky medicine cabinets. The result was the perfect storm of what could possibly go wrong when putting together addicted caregivers and very disabled patients and leaving them to fend for themselves. As you can imagine, it was a big fat mess, so I decided to write about it. So that's the book. Oh, by the way, it's also available in paperback and Kindle, if you prefer those. Another quick tip before I get into today's topic. I noticed a recent article about seasonal weight gain that I'd like to share. The title was, Why Do People Gain Weight in the Fall? I'll put a link in the show notes. Now, this happens to be true, that on average, there's about a 220 calorie difference between what we eat in the fall versus the spring, with a comparatively similar level of temperature swings. And I find it interesting that we even eat more in the fall than in the middle of winter, when we need many more calories to keep ourselves at 98 degrees when it's 20 degrees outside. So the question is, are there genes in our bodies that are similar to the genes that trigger overeating in hibernating animals, as well as other mammals and even birds? Turns out the answer is yes. We conserve energy and eat more calories in the fall. It was an evolutionary modification in our genetics that until recently was necessary to prevent starvation during the winter months when food was scarce. I once went to Pioneer Village in Salem, Mass., where I live, and they talk about surviving the winter of 1630. almost 1/3 of the population of Salem died that winter, primarily from starvation, which creates hypothermia. So we all tend to eat more as the days get shorter. And some people think it might not be a coincidence that Thanksgiving dinner, almost 400 years ago, was in the fall. It may have been as much about hoarding calories to fend off starvation than giving thanks for the bountiful harvest. But then along came refrigerators, and now it works against us. The general recommendation this guy had was to be conscious, to avoid overeating, and stick to your regular eating and sleeping patterns as much as possible. The exception is the eating just before bedtime. He recommends eating your last meal at least 3 hours before going to bed and have a light snack at bedtime, say fruit or nuts, or popcorn. And it's no surprise that there's a strong correlation between sugar and fat calories just before bedtime and waist circumference, which goes hand in hand with metabolic syndrome. And this seems like common sense, but he decided to mention it, so I will as well. Avoid drinking too much water just before bedtime, for obvious reasons. Now, if you are a shift worker that alternates your shifts, you might want to check with your healthcare professional about ways to minimize the adverse effects on your weight and sugar. I've had a few clients who are nurses, and they find it very difficult to work the 11 to 7 shift and go to bed without food. So I'll leave the link to that in the show notes. Okay, back to the sell-by dates. First, a disclaimer. There are tens of thousands of foods in the grocery store, and I certainly won't get to all types. I'm going to focus on the foods that most people are curious about. If you have a question about a specific food, don't hesitate to get in touch with me on my contact page, which is on my website, healingoutsidethebox.com, and I'll leave you a link to that. Now, the second disclaimer is that I might sound preachy in this episode. You shouldn't do this, you can't do that, blah, blah, blah. Basically, you can do whatever your little heart desires, and I bet you know that. My job is to advise you on the best way to avoid getting sick. If you drink orange juice that has turned, it will be unpleasant. But if you consume dairy products that are loaded with pathogenic bacteria, that's another story altogether. So first of all, everything we eat should go bad. It's food. But as I'm hinting at, there's a difference between spoilage organisms and pathogenic organisms. Here I have a note in my notes for this episode that says, remind them about fast food hamburger experiments. I don't know if you may remember, but people on YouTube put fast food items in glass jars to see how long it would take certain items to go bad. FYI, there was a little theater there. Some of those items didn't go bad because they had dried up, and organisms need moisture to grow out. They were hinting at the fact that there are multiple mysterious ingredients in these fast foods. If a particular food that should go bad doesn't go bad for months, it is more than likely loaded with preservatives. The exception would be the food that is preserved in more natural ways, such as drying, salting, adding acid or lowering the pH, fermenting, and, of course, heating. Pathogenic bacteria and viruses like our body temperature, so you need to heat the food much higher than that, well over 102 degrees Fahrenheit. Cheese is preserved by many methods, including salting, drying, adding beneficial fermentation bacteria to outgrow the pathogens, making the food more acidic with the fermentation, and in the case of wet cheeses, storage in the refrigerator. Winemaking involves allowing the fermentation bacteria to give the juice acidity and alcohol, Both discourage the growth of pathogenic bacteria. So the general answer to how long foods can be left alone before they go bad is, well, it depends. That's why we have sell-by dates. And that's why we have noses to sniff the food if we still have a question about whether or not it has turned, as they say. The nose knows. Having said all that, there is generally a rule of thumb to follow according to the type of food. So let's go over the general categories. Now, meat, chicken, and fish should go first because it is the most important one to get right. Pathogenic bacteria love foods that are high in protein. Compared to spoilage organisms, meat, chicken, and fish need to be heated to an internal temperature of at least 135 degrees or salted heavily to keep the pathogens from growing. The exceptions are sushi, ceviche, or perhaps steak tartare. They may use acid in the form of lime juice, add lots of salt, and have very strict rules on how to store and prepare these foods. But none of these foods should ever be eaten by pregnant women, which tells you that there is still some risk. In the case of eating raw beef, it is toxoplasmosis from a parasite that is dangerous. But there are strict rules as to how long to keep these uncooked foods at room temperature when they are presented. My opinion, and it's only my opinion, is that some restaurants push the envelope too much when it comes to sushi and ceviche. But that's just me, having maybe taken one too many food microbiology courses. Oh, now the microwave. Just a note, do not heat up something dense like a chicken pot pie in the microwave. More than a few people have been killed by botulism when the pie does not get heated thoroughly. Remember that the microwave only penetrates 2 inches into the item with enough heat to kill bacteria. Botulism spores will definitely survive the microwave. As for cooked meat, chicken, and fish, remember the 2-hour rule. Once cooked, these foods should only be left out for 2 hours. Beyond that time, sadly, they should be discarded. Let's go back to cheese, because I forgot something about sell-by dates. Cheese is a fermented product. It relies on multiple ways of preserving to stay good for weeks or months. In the case of Parmesan, it's years. Acidity, moisture content, low moisture, and the additional beneficial bacteria, as well as salt, all play a role. It's a bit of a balancing act. The species of organism, whether it be bacteria or mold, will determine the taste and texture of the final product. For example, cottage cheese has a higher water content and is not fermented, so it tends to attract spoilage bacteria. So the makers have to add more acidity and a surprisingly high salt content to avoid spoilage. Even with the salt, the sell-by date will only give you a few weeks, not months. That is also true to some extent about fresh mozzarella. It has a higher moisture content, so it spoils faster. When most cheeses turn, they will simply taste bad with an annoying mold. In cheeses like blue cheese and Roquefort, they use a beneficial mold to preserve the cheese by kicking out the spoilage molds. Now, in terms of plain old milk, fresh milk will last in the fridge for generally only about a week. Organic milk lasts a lot longer, maybe 2 weeks. My theory about that is that there is less of a transfer of bacteria, notably E. coli, from sources like infections on the dairy cow's udder, but that's just a guess. In the summer, if you leave milk out on the counter for any length of time, you can probably cut that week down quite a bit. And keep in mind that in the summer months, the stainless steel trucks driving the milk to your grocery store will heat up if the temperature outside is 100 degrees. Obviously, the milk will spoil faster. So whenever in doubt, sniff the milk. If you pick up any sour smell, you should probably toss it or heat it up until it steams. Temperatures that high will kill off some of the spoilage bacteria. Milk can be frozen up to 3 months, but not so much sour cream or ricotta cheese. Now I'll just do eggs and then I'll wrap for this week. When it comes to eggs, sell-by dates are important. Always purchase the eggs well before the sell-by date, as the refrigerators in supermarkets tend to be opened constantly. This will raise the temperature. Generally speaking, eggs will last in the fridge for about 3 weeks. Again, if it's 100 degrees outside and they're being trucked in, maybe not so much. When it comes to eggs, people tend to forget to check the sell-by date once their eggs are in the fridge. I plead guilty to this, but I'm guessing I'm not the only one. Okay, so I'm going to end here for part 1, and I'll get to cooking oils, produce, and condiments next week. Until then, stay well and stay tuned for another episode of Healing Outside the Box.